BEOWULF, Age of Heroes.
Hello, it's John Hodgson here. Welcome to episode 2 of BEOWULF Age of Heroes podcast. I am not here with Jacob because he lives in America and I'm here in Scotland, but he will be joining us on the pre-recorded section you're about to hear. So in this episode we're going to delve into the first proper chapter of the book, which is all about the setting, the world of BEOWULF. You can find out loads more about BEOWULF Age of Heroes at our website, www.handiwork.games. And if you go to the BEOWULF page, there is a ton of stuff to dig into, loads of videos to watch. And if you want to pick up a copy of the book itself, or any of the accessories like miniatures and tokens and so on, you can do so at a store. It's right there. Okay, on with the show. Thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, smash that whatever bell button thing, them things cool people say, I don't know.
BEOWULF, Age of Heroes.
So next we're going to talk about part 1 of the World of BEOWULF. And this is our setting chapter that John graciously wrote, and it introduces us to the like he said, the kind of implied setting. The most important thing to understand about how we're approaching the setting of BEOWULF is that we are not academic researchers or archaeologists or anything like that. We are not particularly interested in the exact migration era specifics in the real world. We are taking the approach of storytellers. So what's happening is that the adventure is basically a story being told by a scop, a old English bard, and the adventure is taking place in that story world. So we are not precisely worried about what exact part of Northern Europe that the story is taking place of, and we're definitely not worried about particular realistic concerns. It is a story, it's a fantasy story, and it's going to take some twists and turns as the hero fights the monster.
Yeah, do you know, I really like the idea of drawing parallels between in the poem, which is an English poem, told in England, but it's told about the ancestors of the people telling the story. And the fact it's set in sort of Geatland, which is southern Sweden, modern-day Sweden, and Denmark, and mentions various other places in that locale, I believe is kind of equivalent to a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's not really about Denmark. The poem doesn't concern itself with details of historical Denmark. It's only really about characters and some very localized, specific happenings, which is great for as for a role-playing game setting. I think we've tried really hard, and if you read the book, I hope you'll forgive. There is an element of repetition in really hammering home. This is your sort of migration era story world. You can do what you want with it because you have that freedom of it, it's a storyteller's story. We don't in the poem of Beowulf boasts about things he's done, all his swimming feats and fighting undersea monsters and stuff, and none of that's particularly realistic, and nor is a dragon or a trollish sort of monster. These are not real things. They're fantastical story things, and I think we wanted to provide a setting and a set of tools that would let you make adventures with a similar feel, and they can be as historically accurate as you want them to be, with half an eye on the fact Beowulf there's a great deal to learn about history from Beowulf, but it is not a historical account, even though scholars years ago spent a great deal of time trying to prove that it was, handily ignoring the dragon.
Yes.
Maybe it was real.
Yes, if you want to get into that, read Beowulf and the Critics by J.R.R. Tolkien, and about, he kind of revolutionized the approach to the poem by taking a look as a poem and a story, and a setting in value of itself, and as opposed to let's try to go through here and locate the Great Hall or the exact location of where Beowulf was from or what have you. So
Yeah, do you know, as a total aside, I've got, as part of the reading, I did a fantastically large amount of reading. It's a period I'm very familiar with before I began all this. Obviously, with the work I did on various Lord of the Rings games, I'd read up on all Tolkien's influences, from which Beowulf really stands out for me personally. So I was already pretty familiar, and it was already I worked on the Lord of the Rings games because of my interest in kind of migration era stuff. I was the illustrator on Warhammer Historical for a very long time, and books like Shield Wall and Age of Arthur really, that's my period, if you like. But one of the things I was going to mention that I read, I've got a fantastic gift from my best friend of many years. Bought me this very vintage, 120-year-old book about Beowulf, and in that book they spend a lot of time trying to figure out. There's a line in the poem about swords that is obviously describing pattern welded swords. But at this point, when this book examining the poem Beowulf is written, they don't know that the Anglo-Saxons made a lot of pattern welded swords that have these like smoke-like or snake-like patterns. They do know about Damascene steel, or Damascus steel, Damascene blades, and so on that have that appearance, but they only know them from the Middle East. And there's a wonderful essay where they're trying to figure out how Beowulf has, almost like an Arabic sword, which is kind of hilarious because if you know the history, the people in the Middle East were desperately buying up what they called Frankish swords for the Damascene blades that the sort of people in Northwest Europe were making. And were trading with the Middle East until it was made illegal under, I think it's for the Frankish Empire, made it illegal to sell swords in the Middle East because so many swords were going, and the stories of burials being dug up to illicitly sell buried swords. This is all real, real history. So yeah, it's fascinating to see how scholars over the years have looked at Beowulf, which is nothing to do with what I'm supposed to be talking about. But there's all this stuff in there. I'm going to start looking at some actual pages in the book so we can focus about what we actually wrote.
It's all good.
So yeah, so I should mention, every chapter in the book, Beowulf, has double-page spread of artwork and a poem by an old friend of mine, Dave Oliver from Rattlebox Theatre. He does a fantastic Beowulf puppet show. He's an absolutely brilliant performer, and I've known him for years. Fantastic. So yeah, Rattlebox Theatre is well worth searching online because he has some great videos of his performances, but he's written poems,
yes,
especially for us.
Yeah, special evocative Beowulf style poems to introduce each of the chapters, their parts.
Yep. Very nice. So yeah, this section opens with a little bit about the real world. Not too much. We're at great pains, as I say, to emphasize you don't need to be a history buff. Beowulf is an adventure story from the angle we're choosing to look at it. I mean, there's loads of other stuff in there. It's a classic of literature, but also it is an adventure story with monsters and all that cool stuff. And if you want to make it really super realistic because you already know lots about Anglo-Saxons, or perhaps you want to take it a little bit later, be a bit more about Vikings and so on, you can do that. This game will not stand in your way. It is a story world, so hopefully the player and the GM are free to bring stuff to it and play in quite a creative way with a strong flavour of the period we're trying to evoke, without it holding you back. That's probably one of the key creative goals of this part of the book, really, is to empower you to have an understanding of the people who are described in the poem and how they lived and their customs and so on, all in the name of making really cool adventures that feel like Beowulf. But you don't need to know the ins and outs of Anglo-Saxon history, migration era history. But if you do know some stuff, you can use it. So that's all cool. And hopefully, we provide a really extensive reading list at the back of the book. And hopefully you can, you'll dip into that and learn some really interesting stuff. I mean, I've learned tons and tons of things.
Beowulf, Age of Heroes.
So yeah, like John said, we've got a little bit of an introduction to things and some important notes about how to interpret the poem, and then we get a wonderful, wonderful map of the lands between the two seas, as we like to call them. And this shows you basically an idea of the different areas in the north of Europe, with some names of various different locations and tribes. Again, it's still very much a storytelling setting. So we're giving you some information about where people traditionally are from. But if you want to, you can always simply have something happen in a particular corner. And especially during this time, a king and a kingdom are not huge, vast geopolitical entities. It can be as simple as you're the king, you've got a mead hall, you've got a dozen warriors, and you control an area of about as far as you can see from your mead hall to the forest and to the ocean. And so, you can have an adventure in that area without necessarily worrying about too much about where it's geographically located and what the larger political ramifications might be.
Absolutely. I mean, this is another important part. There's a note on the map which I just wrote as a bit of a joke while I was making it, because it was tremendously difficult to gather any sort of accurate information. And I was when we were making this map, I was drawing on about 400 or 500 years worth of different, peoples living around the edges of what we now call the Baltic and the North Seas. And some of the names are familiar, some aren't, trying to avoid too much sort of Romanized names and things like that, and gathering different bits and bobs from here and there. And I wrote this note on the map that says a map of peoples and places in which many of both are drawn from centuries of tales and whose names and placements are at best unreliable.
Yeah.
Which is sort of, it's a bit funny and it's a bit self-deprecating, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, we struggled for a good amount of the development time as to what the map would look like if there was even going to be a map.
Yeah, because there aren't, the Anglo-Saxons are not big map makers as people go. And because we started off, remember this, we really wanted a map, and that you would sort of plot out sea journeys, and it was all a sort of weird, different version of, not a hex crawl would be the utterly wrong way to describe it, but you would build a network of journeys around the sort of Whale Road, and then, I don't know, after months of struggling with this, we just sort of gave it up and went, actually, this is so difficult to implement for Beowulf. It's wrong. It's the wrong thing. Stories don't... I mean, the actual poem of Beowulf pretty much says, Beowulf... we should sort of save this for later, because the structure of how Beowulf departs on his journey to Denmark is very important to the structure of the adventure chapter. But it happens very quickly. Beowulf does a short series of things to get his ship ready. Right. He has a ship built. He checks the portents and omens, and then he sails to Denmark. And because he's awesome, he just goes straight there. Yep. And you suddenly go, we don't need to worry so much about geographical locations and tracking. See, tracking journey seemed like quite a nice thing. It would have been nice. I still will do that with something eventually. Right. Like players drawing their own maps always excites me. But it just didn't fit, and we were trying really hard to make it fit, and it didn't. So it's not, we don't do that.
Yeah. Our approach is a little different. Like I said, we'll talk to it a little more when we get to the voyages area. But
Okay. Yeah, we should look at what, because we can talk. We're on page 14 of the book, and we could talk for infinite time about all of this stuff. We just quickly running through what's actually in here. So there's a discussion of the important things to the setting. Foremost of which, really, at this point, is the Whale Road, and the idea that all journeys and travelling within the world of Beowulf really are happening by sea. And the areas of habitation border the sea. And this is really important to understand later, because every hero that you'll play has their own ship. It's slightly different than one might expect from a typical sort of medieval-inspired fantasy game, in that we don't really have towns and cities. There aren't castles and things like that. It really is... Kings rely on building a hall, a mead hall, where they rule from, and they basically they're the givers of privilege, really, of wealth and indeed literally mead. They're the people that have centralized power. They control what people do which they may do benevolently. I'm tying myself up in knots trying to describe the entire contents of a huge section of this chapter in like as I'm talking. We describe the way society works in the kind of ancestor time of the migration era.
Right.
And there's loads and loads of stuff in there in the book to point you in the right direction.
Yeah, and like John said, you do not have to be a scholar, do not have to be a historian. We'll give you the basics of what you need to know about the societies that you're going to be interacting with or be portraying as the GM, and that's generally speaking all you need. And again, it's very much a storytelling environment. If you have a particularly unusual king or queen or whatnot, that's fine. It's just part of the story.
Yep, it's really, in a weird way, it was, because one of the challenges in designing the whole thing is how do you impart a historical setting, if you like, especially in an era which we don't actually have all that much evidence about. I mean, more and more, and there's more scholarship around this kind of era of history, year on year. But that's not really what we're trying to do.
Right.
We've said that a lot of times. So yeah, there's a lot there to get stuck into. It's quite interesting. The map contains a lot of places and a lot of names of peoples. We don't bother ourselves too much with that. Your characters and so on are not defined by where they come from particularly. We didn't divide up character generation by location or anything like that. We'll come to that in a little bit.
Yep. I think we can,
really important.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say that I think like I said, we have a lot of setting information. I think probably our next biggest thing to go into is the old ways and the new way.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So one of the most interesting things about the poem, and this is something that you in any translation generally comes through very strongly, is that it is a pagan hero doing heroic pagan things in that environment, written down by Christians. So you can see that there's a tension and a meeting point there between what we call the old ways, the various pagan philosophies and religions, and the new way, the church. And the church is not the church of the 21st century. It is a new disruptive force coming in and saying, hey, we believe that everybody should be free. We'd love to teach you how to read so you can read our book. And it's also something that's been very well adopted across Southern Europe, and so it's a gateway to a process where you can become part of something larger by taking on the new belief. So there's a interesting tension in the poem between the old ways and the church, and we do actually provide that in the game. Your alignment is either with the new church or with the old ways, or neutral. And we find that a lot, like in burial locations, you might have a crucifix and also various items representing the old gods as well. A lot of people during the time were basically okay, well, this is interesting to me, but I'm not going to completely forsake my old ways. I'm going to kind of adapt and integrate.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting thing to include in a game that we do have our own sort of. It is Christianity. We don't generally use the term Christianity in the game, just to give it a little bit of a remove, because the church in the first millennium CE is very, very different to the church now. You've got to it's like when is the King James Bible written? 1500. 1500s, I should say.
Yep.
That's a long way from 500 AD.
Yeah.
That's 1,000 years in the future. And it was absolutely fascinating. Again, this doesn't necessarily figure on the pages of Beowulf, but I did an enormous amount of research into the early Christian church to be able to sort of distill it down into something for the game table. And we had a lot of discussion about whether we were going to address Christianity in the game. It's a hot button topic for some people. And again, similarly with the sort of pagan religion in it. I mean, even the word pagan, is pagan a derogatory term? It is to some people. it isn't to others. Some people are proudly pagans. Others don't like the term. We're dealing with real world religions, both in terms of Christianity and the sort of the old gods, as we've termed it. And I like to think we've done quite a good job of it. I think there will be some adjustment needed to get your head around how different the old church, the early church is. It is a different kettle of fish. The great thing is, though, again, because it's a storytelling game and because it's one GM, one player, that really feeds into the alignment and the faith that the player's hero has can set the tone for the game. I think if you were doing this multiplayer, it would be, which you can do with the rules, you'll have to think a little bit if you have a bunch of mixed heroes, all adventuring together, that you may have to do a little bit more negotiation around it. But in the primary mode of play with one player and one GM, it's really interesting. Yeah, it sets the tone rather than being a cause for sort of philosophical discussion throughout the game. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. There's so much we could say about that.
Yep.
I think there's an enormous amount for people to use, in their own games and decide how they want to run it.
Right.
But I think, if I say so myself, I think we've done an all right job of it.
Yes.
I am greatly amused by the fact that in our world, Christianity tends to be seen as a conservative thing, right? I mean, more radical evangelical Christians would argue with that. My wife, who is a Christian, would argue with that. I'm not a Christian, by the way, just in case you're wondering. But in the era that this game is set, it's a new thing. It's a radical thing. It's the conservative force is the sort of pantheon of Woden and Thunor. They're the traditionalists.
Right.
They're the ones that don't really want things to change, whereas the church coming in and providing literacy, freeing slaves. We can talk about slavery in a little bit. It's a radicalizing force, and I love that it's an immigrant religion. To some degree, there was already in the British Isles. We already have the insular or Celtic Church is already there. The Church of Rome has already been there, but it's kind of diminished greatly by the departure of the Romans and the immigration of the Anglo-Saxons, who at that time were not Christians. There's a lot going on there, and there's a lot you can see in the Beowulf poem about it, about a people trying to digest both their sort of ancestor worship and their newer faith of Christianity. I think it's really fascinating, and it's quite difficult to just give you soundbite stuff in this about it. I think it's interesting.
Yep.
Interesting. And of course, if you're not interested in all that, you just don't really use it.
Right.
You can read the poem of Beowulf without getting too caught up in the religious angle of it. Yep. But I think it's a really vital part of the setting.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. Something very quickly to talk about why this matters and why it's in Beowulf. There's a bit in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Critics and the Monsters where he talks about the idea that the traditional northern pagan view is of a doomed world that is going to be devoured by monsters inevitably. The monsters are going to win. They're going to defeat the gods, or the gods will die defeating the monsters, and a new cycle will begin. And there's an enormous, sort of melancholic doom, that humanity is doomed in a sort of uncaring universe. The gods are fickle and largely unkind, really, to people. The only way to sort of win in existence is to die an enormously noble, heroic death, and then you get to sort of the heaven equivalent. You get to go to Valhalla and feast with the gods. But they're the only people that get anywhere, as sort of warriors that die a glorious death. And then in comes Christianity and says, well, no, actually, there's a God that cares about you personally. There is a road to sort of everlasting life and a positive view of hope for the future. And you go, oh, that's why that is part of why it caught on.
Right.
Because it didn't catch on because they went around stabbing everyone until everyone agreed to be Christians. There's a bit of that later, quite a lot of that later on. But early on, no, it's not really like that. And I spent a lot of time looking into why did people convert?
Right.
interesting. Anyway, it's just quite controversial because I'm sure a lot of people will be annoyed hearing me say that in an unfashionably positive view of early Christianity.
Yeah, but like you said, the early church is very different than our present day environment. Very different politically, very different culturally. So.
Yeah, really, it's fascinating to read about. I strongly recommend reading about the early church. It's so complicated as well that there's loads of stuff that doesn't appear in our game, because our game focuses much more on a sort of almost like Friar Tuck in Robin Hood. His kind of Christianity is pretty much what we're seeing almost.
Right.
It's a sort of storybook version of Christianity.
Right.
But the real history is really fascinating and bonkers. I mean, Christianity nearly had two gods. The Bible is not settled upon at this point at all. Arianism and so on, all well worth looking up. Really interesting about whether. Oh, anyway, I'm going down a rabbit hole. We'll probably cut loads of this out.
Beowulf, Age of Heroes.
Hello, it's John again, just doing a bit of an outro now that the episode is finished. Yeah, that was good, wasn't it? A bit rambly, but I hope you enjoyed it. So Beowulf, Age of Heroes is out now in PDF. You can get that at Drive-Thru RPG. You can also pre-order the print version right now at the Handiwork Games web store, which I think is handiwork.games/shop, if I remember rightly. But if you go to handiwork.games, you'll be able to find it. And there's all sorts of other accessories there available too. You can buy a complete pack of everything we do. You can get amazing oak chests are available for pre-order to hold your inspiration tokens. The inspiration tokens are well worth a look. They work with any 5e game, or well, in fact, any game at all that needs tokens. They're absolutely gorgeous. They're kind of poker chip sized, metal, really thick with gems set into them and beautiful Beowulf designs. We've got our miniatures. So there's all sorts. I shouldn't go on. I'm trying to just do a quick end to the show. But there's all sorts there. So swing by handiwork.games and take a look. And we'll be back next week with another episode where we look at the next chapter in Beowulf Age of Heroes, which is creating a hero, I do believe. Speak to you then.